Hello there everybody, welcome to another video on the channel and welcome to my Gran Turismo 7 PSVR2 review. I'm not going to look at the hardware based on all the other software out there that is available. I'm just going to look at it through the lens of Gran Turismo 7, give you my honest thoughts, feelings and opinions, maybe help you if you're sitting on the fence at the moment and whether you want to splash out £530 on a piece of hardware just for one game. Going to divide the review into a number of sections as you can see on the screen there. No messing about here. Without further ado, let's move on to the first of those sections, and that is going to be that initial wow factor. Now, if like me you have never played a racing game in VR, the first time you are transported into the car you are going to be incredibly impressed, immersed and probably a little bit in shock. Just the way that everything is wrapped around you, the size, the scale, it is an absolute wow factor. Probably one of the biggest wow factors I've ever had in gaming. I just could not quite believe what I was seeing the first time I was kind of transported into this Porsche Cayman around Interlagos. That was basically the first thing that I did. Picked a random car, picked a random track, and yeah, I was aghast, you know, mouth wide open. I couldn't quite believe it. I felt like I was sitting in the car, particularly if you're in a sim rig. Obviously you're in quite a natural driving position as well, using the wheel. Everything just seemed to be where it should be. Everything felt so real. The lighting, when it came shining into the cockpit, I remember saying to myself, the sun looks real. Everything, I mean, it just was an incredibly immersive moment. I was in total disbelief at what I was experiencing and what I was seeing, and driving straight away just felt incredibly natural and intuitive as well. Again, the scale, the size, everything just was where it was meant to be on the car, on the track, and from the get-go, from the very first lap, I had zero trouble hitting apexes, absolutely no trouble judging the depth of the corners. As I said, everything just felt so natural. It felt like sitting in an actual car, and I cannot stress enough that what you're seeing on screen from my videos or anybody else's videos or any live streams you're watching out there do not give anywhere near a true example of what it feels like to have the headset on and actually be in the actual virtual reality of the car. The only way I can kind of describe to give you anywhere near the impression of what it's like, if you've not had a chance to try VR for yourself, is to just go and sit in a real car and start looking around, because that is the perspective, that is the image you have when you are in VR on Gran Turismo 7. It really is quite something to behold. So next up on the agenda is, can you be competitive in VR? Now this is a question I reckon if to ask anyone that has PSVR2, you're probably going to get a slightly different answer from everybody. Now, as someone who used to race in sport mode in 2D cockpit view, I feel I'm in quite a good position to answer this question. Now I certainly know now, having moved away from cockpit view in 2D and moved back to roof cam or bonnet cam, whatever you want to call it, that I was giving up a certain amount of time per lap whilst driving in cockpit view. Depending on the car, depending on the track, it would kind of differ. Some tracks were better than others, some cars were better than others for visibility, but on average I would say you were giving up at least 3 to 4 attempts per lap driving in cockpit view in 2D versus something like bumper cam or hood cam. What I will say straight away is that many of the limitations of driving in cockpit view in 2D are removed or mitigated by driving in VR. So let me try and give you an example of what I mean. So if I'm sitting in my sim rig in 2D in cockpit view and I was to put my hand out in front of my face, palms towards me, maybe about a foot in front of my face, I can pretty much block out the entirety of the windscreen or the real estate that I have to look at on the screen in order to drive the car. If you do that in real life, which is the perspective you get in VR, then sure, you kind of affect your visibility directly ahead of you, but you can move your head to look around that. You can still see plenty of the road and visibility to the side of that, or plenty of the windscreen to the side of that. So yeah, sure, you kind of block that kind of directly in front of your eye line, but you still have plenty of real estate to play with, which is not the case when you are in 2D. And that is probably the best way that I can kind of describe how much more visibility you have in VR in cockpit view than you do in cockpit view on a flat screen, regardless of the size of the telly that you are playing on. Now moving on to actual lap times, I did a number of this week's Daily Race C Group 2 cars at Lago Maggiore, and pretty much kind of was sitting the same sort of lap times, getting the same kind of results. It's maybe not the best example. The dirty air in this race means that sometimes you don't quite get to use the full speed of the car, but I did do a time trial session in VR on the day that I got the unit and compared it to my time that I had done in hood cam earlier on in the week, and within a few laps I was round about half a second off the pace, and the next day I jumped back in with the kind of mindset that I want to beat that flat screen time in VR, and after about 16-17 laps, having came very close a number of times, I eventually managed to go faster by a couple of tenths, and then actually set a lap time just a tenth off that on the next one around. In terms of lap time, we were able to go a little bit faster, and consistency was pretty good as well. Does this mean that VR is faster than flat screen? No, I could probably have pushed the flat screen time faster as well. But what it does tell me is that you can be every bit as fast in VR as you can in any other view. Of course, it may not happen straight away for you. It will probably take a little bit of you getting used to it, particularly if you never drove in cockpit view before. I maybe had a little bit of an advantage, having still had a bit of residual muscle memory from when I used to drive in cockpit view. But yeah, from my findings, I reckon you can be every bit as fast in VR as you can in any of the other viewpoints. But as I said as well, I think if you ask this question to anyone that's had a bit of experience in PSVR2, you may well get a different answer. I think somebody might qualify for the World Tour Finals in VR. What will be quite interesting is, will they actually be allowed to race at the World Tour Finals in VR? Or possibly, maybe they should make everybody drive in VR at the World Tour Finals. That would be kind of cool. But moving on, let's take a look at something I just want to cover very quickly, and that is VR sickness. Did I experience any VR sickness over the course of the 5 or 6 days that I've been playing in VR? The short answer is VR sickness, no. Was there a couple of corners where I felt my belly go a little bit funny? Yes. Coming through the second part of the Senna S and the Porsche Cayman on day 1 felt a little bit weird, and coming through Big Banky Boy in the Group 2 cars at Lago Maggiore certainly sent the stomach into a couple of cartwheels, but nothing that made me want to stop. And after a few laps, certainly going through the banked corner, I felt that that kind of feeling dissipated fairly quickly. So in Gran Turismo 7, I never really experienced any kind of ill effects from the VR. I think maybe it's to do with the fact that, you know, I'm playing in a seated position. Everything feels very natural around me. As I said, if you're sitting in the sim rig with the wheel in front of you, everything kind of feels like where it should be. And obviously got a little bit of experience of driving in real life as well, so maybe that helps. What I will say, having played some of the other VR games out there, Horizon Zero Dawn, I played a bit of Pavlov, I was playing some kind of Cactus World War II game, Star Wars game, so standing up and using VR, I definitely felt a couple of times, you know, a little bit more wobbly on my legs than at any point I did in Gran Turismo 7, so I'm not saying it's not a thing, but for me personally, VR sickness in GT7 never really materialised whatsoever. Next up, we're going to take a look at the VR Showroom. Now, this was something I didn't think I would have that much of an interest in, but I have to say, it's a pretty cool feature. Again, what you see on screen, what you see on streams, what you see in other people's videos do not give anywhere near the representation of what you see when you're actually in it yourself. Again, the only way I can kind of give you an example of what it's like if you haven't had the chance to use it yourself is to go outside, stand next to a car and take a look, walk around it, take a look at it, because that's pretty much what it's like when you are in the actual game yourself, in the VR. You feel like you're right next to the car, you can get as close to it or pretty much as close to it as you want to, and yeah, to be honest with you, some of the details that are into the cars are really quite mind-blowing. If you are a car enthusiast, then this is definitely something you will get a lot of value out of. I certainly thought it was a little bit gimmicky when I first heard of it, but having experienced it myself, I've got to admit, it's something I could probably see myself coming back to just to check out some of the finer details on the cars. Next up, the downsides of PSVR on Gran Turismo 7. There's 3 things I want to mention here. 2 of them I shall go through very quickly, and then there's the third thing that definitely warrants a bit of further discussion. The first downside is the lack of heads-up display that you get in VR compared to 2D. So in a race you lose the relative, so you have no idea what drivers are around you, how far they are in front or behind, or how far behind the leader that you are. So that is a little bit annoying. You lose your delta as well when you're doing time trial. The second one, we actually put a video out about it just a couple of days ago, and that is the lack of adjustability to your seating position whilst in VR. Both of those are fairly minor gripes. They should get fixed, I think, in the future. The bigger one that definitely warrants being discussed though is that visual downgrade. Obviously a little bit of a hot topic at the moment, not just for Gran Turismo 7 but also for PSVR2 in general. Now I have to put a disclaimer in here. This is obviously my first experience of VR. Possibly came in with maybe expectations a little bit too high, but I was quite surprised. After that kind of initial wow factor wears off, I was quite surprised by how soft the image is. Now I do have to again emphasise that the perspective and what you see on screen is completely different to anything you see on the 2D version of the game, so it is actually rendering something completely different, but there is no way of getting around it. The image can be incredibly soft, it can even be a little bit fuzzy. There is a little bit of a screen door effect in there as well, which once you see is kind of hard to unsee. But the biggest problem is really kind of picking out the finer detail in the distance. Around about the cockpit, everything looks pretty natural, pretty sharp, quite sort of photorealistic in a lot of ways. But looking into the distance down the track, trying to pick out track markers and that can be quite difficult indeed. You have to, this is how close I've got to get to kind of just about pick out the 50 metre board. So yeah, that's when standing still, so you can imagine when you're in motion it can become even more difficult. It might be too much for some people out there, there's no two doubts about it. That kind of, when you kind of see how crisp the image is in 4K on a good 4K telly, or even not a good 4K telly, to how soft the image becomes in VR, it might be a little bit too much for people to take. I will stress that it definitely is worse in kind of darker conditions. You notice the screen door effect a little bit more. The contrast between where some of the curbs meet the track can sometimes make it a little bit difficult to pick out some of your turn-in points and exactly where you're placing the car. When you're in the daylight, I never really experienced that being a problem, but for example this week's daily race C at Maggiore, the last couple of laps the track gets dark, I definitely felt myself struggling. Occasionally, particularly into fast corners, placing the car exactly where I wanted it. Should also mention the HDR lighting that you get in PSVR2 as well. Something I've not really appreciated on a flat screen. I certainly appreciate it in the PSVR2 headset. It can give the lighting an incredibly photorealistic look at times, but sometimes it can also give the game, given that softness as well, things can look a little bit translucent. You're going to have to accept that the visual quality just is not the same when you're playing in virtual reality, and kind of decide between now whether the immense gain and immersion is worth that visual sacrifice. But that's pretty much everything I want to cover in terms of Gran Turismo 7 on PSVR. I'm going to use the next few minutes just to give you like a conclusion and try to answer that all important question as to whether it's worth it just for Gran Turismo 7. But to conclude, honestly, the immersion, the experience, that initial wow factor really is quite something special when you first are teleported into the car. I certainly put it up there in amongst my kind of top 3 gaming moments of my life. Possibly up there with the first time that I played the PlayStation F1 game from the 1995 season, and also along with maybe storming the Normandy beaches in one of the very first Medal of Honor games. PSVR2, Gran Turismo 7 is definitely right up there with some of the most memorable experiences I've ever had when I first jumped in to the headset and was teleported into the car. And the immersion and just the enjoyment of just driving different cars around different tracks and looking around the different interior views of these cars is, you know, something that I could find myself doing for hours and hours and weeks and months, because jumping into every car definitely does feel like a new experience. You know, you can go from a back mono to a 787B that we're in at the moment, to a 60s F1 car, to a go-kart, and it just feels completely different each time. And you know, that kind of, you maybe don't get that wow factor anymore, but it's still an exciting moment every time you go into a new car and you take a look around and see the detail that PD have put in to the, you know, each and every one of the cars in the game. And that perspective and actually being able to kind of, you know, properly appreciate how a track looks from a driver's perspective, coming through the La Chicane here at Spa, you know, Eau Rouge, and a 60s Formula 1 car that we're about to do here. You know, that's just something you're not going to ever experience in real life, and this is probably the closest that many of us will ever get to. However, as I said, once that initial wow factor's worn off, you do start to notice the softness in the graphics. The lack of the HUD and sport mode begins to annoy you. I can't deny it, you know, that these little things do niggle a little bit, but then you'll jump into a different car and a different track you've never done before, and you get that kind of buzz again of, you know, being in the cockpit of a race car that you'll never ever get to experience in real life. You know, it's swings and roundabouts a little bit for me at the moment with PSVR2 on Gran Turismo 7. You know, there is these little things that are starting to bug me a little bit about it, but then I'll jump into, as I said, exactly what I just said there, don't jump into another car, another track, and I'm like, wow, this is pretty incredible actually. And one thing that's definitely got to be mentioned is that at the end of the day, this is a free update from Polyphony Digital as well. There's many companies out there, it's already happened on some of the games for PSVR2, who have charged like a £10 upgrade for stuff like this. So kudos to PD for just the technical achievement of what they've done here, and also making it a free upgrade. You definitely have to give kudos to the company and I guess Sony for that as well. So, an amazing experience. It gives you something that you just cannot come anywhere near to replicating in the 2D game, but there is definitely a few niggles with it as well. Some people will just not get over that soft image. We like shiny stuff, it's natural, we like stuff to look good. It's a visual downgrade from what you're experiencing on your £500,000, £2,000 OLED 4K TV screen. That does bother people, and some people will not be able to get over that barrier. And I can't stress enough that it is quite a significant hit. But again, is it worth it to take that 50% hit on the visuals for a 100% better, more immersive experience? Well, that's up to you to decide. To answer the question, is it worth it just to buy it for Gran Turismo 7? I would say no. But I think, you know, if you were buying PSVR2 just for one game, I just don't think that would be a smart decision anyway. I always said that I was buying this more as an investment. I was more interested, or just as interested, in playing other PSVR2 games out there as well. And Gran Turismo 7 was definitely a big draw for me, being a big fan of the series. But yeah, I've really enjoyed my time in Gran Turismo 7. There's a few things that do niggle me about it, but I've had a great time just overall with PSVR2. Playing Pavlov, the shooting mechanics are amazing. I was playing, what was the other game that I was playing? Horizon Zero Dawn, of course, looks incredible by the way. And a lot of these games do not suffer visually the same way that Gran Turismo seems to suffer, because you're not looking as far into the distance or focused on a particular point in the distance in these games as you sometimes are in Gran Turismo 7. So is it worth it just for GT7? I'd probably say no, but I would say that was a silly decision to make anyway. Is PSVR2 worth it overall? For me so far, yes, I'm really enjoying the experience. It's something new, it's something fresh, something I've never done before. My daughter's getting a lot of value out of it as well. She's absolutely loving the VR, so yeah, that's pretty much all I've got to say, folks. Hopefully this review of sorts, I'm not a reviewer, of course, certainly not a professional reviewer, but hopefully it has been useful in some way, shape or form. Helped you to maybe make a decision if you were on the fence a little bit. If it has, you've enjoyed the video, please hit that like button. Please hit that subscribe button. I shall catch you on the next one. Goodbye now.